The cold winds howled through the ancient walls of Winterfell, carrying whispers of a fate that would never come to pass. Bran Stark sat by the window of his chamber, gazing out at the endless white stretching beyond the castle walls. His legs, useless beneath him, reminded him of the cruel twist of fate that had left him broken. But he was still a Stark, still the son of Eddard Stark, and his destiny was not yet written. Had he journeyed beyond the wall, had he met the three-eyed raven, everything might have been different. But he had never left Winterfell. The raven never came for him, and the visions never burned into his mind. He remained a boy, not a seer, and the world remained blind to what was coming. Without the gift of sight, Bran's days were filled with books and lessons. Maester Luwin, before his passing, had ensured Bran's mind was sharpened like a sword, but no amount of knowledge could prepare him for the war that was coming. He still felt the pull of the old gods, the whispers of the weirwoods calling to him, but he could not understand them. The War of the Five Kings had ended, and the North had been ravaged. Jon Snow had fought bravely against the Boltons, reclaiming Winterfell with Sansa's help, but the price had been heavy. Thousands lay dead, and the scars of battle still marred the land. Bran watched as Jon stood in the courtyard, speaking, with Davos and Sansa, his face grim with the weight of leadership. Without the knowledge of the past and the warnings of the future, Jon remained unaware of his true lineage. To him, he was still just a Stark bastard, a loyal son of the North. The whispers of his true parentage, of his Targaryen blood, remained buried in the past, unknown and insignificant. And without Bran's guidance, no one would ever uncover the truth. But the past had a way of creeping forward. Far beyond the wall the dead marched. The Night King, unseen and unchallenged, grew stronger with each passing day. There was no three-eyed raven to expose his plans, no warnings in the flames, or visions in the weirwoods. When the time came, Westeros would face the dead without knowing how to fight them. Bran did not know any of this as he wheeled himself through the halls of Winterfell. He only knew that the nights had grown colder, the sky darker, and the feeling in his chest heavier. Something was coming, but he did not know what. Winter had arrived, and the world was unprepared. The halls of Winterfell were filled with the hum of preparation. Sansa Stark had taken control of the castle's affairs, ensuring food stores were filled, armor repaired, and men trained for the coming war. But it was a war no one truly understood. Bran watched from his usual place by the fire in the great hall, feeling a strange sense of unease. He was no longer a helpless child, but without the visions of the three-eyed raven, he lacked purpose. Something in him ached to know more, to understand why the world felt as if it was shifting around him. Jon Snow entered, his presence commanding respect from everyone around him. He had changed since reclaiming Winterfell. He carried himself like a true leader, but doubt flickered behind his eyes. "The White Walkers are real," Jon said, his voice edged with frustration as he addressed the gathered lords. "I've seen them. We need to be ready." Sansa nodded, ever the strategist. "We are doing everything we can, Jon, but if the rest of Westeros doesn't believe in this threat, we stand alone." There was silence. Bran listened carefully, though he could offer little to the discussion. Without the three-eyed raven, he had no proof, no knowledge of the long night or the Night King's plans. He had no words that would make the lords believe. Tormund, Giantsbane, who had been standing near the fire, let out a sharp breath. "You think they're waiting? They're not. The dead don't sit around making war councils. They move and they kill. We need to be ready." Jon clenched his jaw. He had fought the dead at Hardhome. He had seen their power firsthand. But without Bran's visions, he had no idea where or when the Night King would strike. The uncertainty left them vulnerable. Beyond the wall, the storm was rising. The Night King stood upon the frozen cliffs, his piercing blue eyes staring into the vast darkness. The dead stretched before him in endless numbers, thousands of wights, White Walkers, and creatures long forgotten by man. There was no three-eyed raven watching him this time, no whispers in the trees, no knowing gaze that could see into his plans. It was time. The march of the dead would not be delayed. The cold seeped into Winterfell like a silent predator, creeping through the cracks in the stone, whispering through the halls. The air felt heavier, thicker, and though none could explain why, a deep unease settled over the castle. Bran sat near the weirwood tree in the godswood, his eyes staring blankly ahead. He had come here seeking peace, but there was no peace to be found. The tree, with its ancient face, seemed to look back at him as if expecting something, but he had nothing to offer. No visions, no answers, only questions that no one could answer. He felt it, something beyond words, beyond understanding, a force pressing against him as if trying to break through. The old gods were whispering, but he could not hear them. Behind him, Meera Reed stood watching, her arms crossed. She had stayed in Winterfell, unwilling to leave Bran despite his insistence that she go home. She had fought too hard to bring him back, and though he was no longer the same boy who had fallen from the tower, she still saw something in him worth protecting. "What are you looking for, Bran?" she finally asked. Bran exhaled slowly. "I don't know." Meera hesitated before stepping closer. "You never went beyond the wall," she said carefully. "You never became the three-eyed raven. But maybe there's still something inside you." Bran turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "Then why can't I see?" The words hung between them, heavy and unanswerable. Winter was tightening its grip on the north. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The people of Winterfell felt it in their bones. And then the ravens arrived. Jon Snow stood in the great hall, reading the message in his hand, with an expression so tense it might have been carved from stone. Sansa sat beside him, reading her own letter. Davos, Tormund, and the gathered lords waited in silence. "The dead have crossed the wall," Jon finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hall fell into a stunned silence. "They destroyed Eastwatch," he continued, looking up at them. "Tormund's men who stayed behind. They're gone." Tormund stiffened, his expression dark. Sansa swallowed hard. "How long before they reach us?" Jon set the letter down, his knuckles white. "A few weeks, maybe less." The weight of those words settled on the room like a death sentence. They had planned for this, prepared as best they could, but no amount of steel or training could prepare them for the dead. Bran listened from his place at the far end of the hall. His heart pounded, something inside him stirred, a pressure, a pull. The old gods were calling. He just didn't know if he was ready to listen. The cold had become unbearable, not just the kind that seeped through walls and chilled the flesh, but a deeper, unnatural cold that settled into the bones, a cold that felt like death itself. Winterfell prepared as best as it could. The walls had been reinforced, the food stores rationed, and every able-bodied man and woman had been given weapons. But no one could shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. Bran sat in the Godswood again, but this time he wasn't alone. Sansa had come to him, standing beside the weirwood tree, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked. Bran turned his head slightly. His gaze was distant, his thoughts lost in something he couldn't understand. "Yes." Sansa sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. "Jon is trying to be strong, but I can see it in his eyes. He's afraid." Bran studied her, noting the way her voice wavered slightly. She had become so strong, so composed, but even she could not hide her fear. "We don't have the advantage," she continued. "We don't even know if we can win this." Bran lowered his eyes. "I should know something. I should see something." His fingers clenched against his legs. "But I don't." Sansa was quiet for a long moment before she crouched beside him. "Then we'll have to fight without knowing," she said. "We'll have to fight like Starks." Her words carried the weight of their ancestors, the memory of those who had fought and died to protect the North. But Bran still felt the hollowness inside him, the missing piece that should have been there. He didn't know if he could be what they needed. The White Walkers had never moved this quickly before. Scouts sent south from Last Hearth had seen them, coming, an endless army of the dead stretching as far as the eye could see. And leading them was the Night King, mounted atop his undead dragon, a vision of death itself. Jon stood atop the walls of Winterfell, watching as the torches of the last of the retreating scouts flickered in the distance. He gripped the hilt of Longclaw tightly. This was it. "They're close," Davos said beside him. His voice was grim, steady. Jon exhaled. "Are the gates sealed?" "Aye. Everyone who could make it inside is here. We've got the Unsullied. On the front, the Northmen reinforcing them, and the Vale guarding the walls. The catapults are ready." Jon nodded, his eyes never leaving the darkness. The dead were out there, watching, waiting. A sound echoed across the frozen land, a distant, bone-chilling roar. "The dragon!" The ground trembled beneath them. Tormund came rushing up the steps, his face flushed from the cold. "They're here," he said simply. Jon's grip tightened on his sword. The battle for the living had begun. The horns of Winterfell sounded 3 times, an ancient warning that had not been heard in generations. The dead had arrived. Jon stood on the battlements, his breath misting in the freezing air. Below, the armies of the living braced themselves. The Unsullied stood in perfect formation, shields raised. The Northmen clutched their swords, shifting nervously. The Knights of the Vale sat on their horses, waiting for the charge. A deathly silence fell over the battlefield. Then the first shadow moved. Out of the darkness they came. An ocean of rotting flesh and glowing blue eyes, the whites surged forward like a wave, their twisted forms clawing and scrambling toward the castle. The sound of their shrieks and moans filled the air, mixing with the distant howling of the wind. "Archers!" Jon bellowed. A volley of flaming arrows soared through the sky, raining down upon the dead. Many fell, burning and writhing in the snow, but it was like throwing pebbles into a storming sea. The rest
just kept coming. The catapults
fired next, launching great balls of fire into the mass of corpses. Explosions of flame lit up the night, momentarily revealing the full scope of the horror. Thousands upon thousands of undead, stretching beyond what the eye could see. John felt his stomach tighten. This was worse than Hardhome, worse than anything
he had imagined. A terrible roar split the air. John looked up just in time to see Viserion, the undead dragon, diving toward the castle. His blue fire erupted from his jaws, engulfing part of the outer wall in icy flame.
Stone cracked and shattered, sending men screaming to their deaths. From the other side of the battlefield, two great wings flapped. Drogon and Rhaegal had taken to the sky. Daenerys, atop Drogon, let out a fierce cry and urged her dragon toward the undead beast. The battle had truly begun. Inside Winterfell, Bran sat in his chamber, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. He could hear the screams outside, the sounds of battle, of death. Something inside him stirred. He closed his eyes, breathing in the energy around him. The godswood, the castle, the very land itself. There was something there, a power, deep and old, waiting. He reached for it. The world around him blurred, his consciousness stretching outward. He wasn't warging into summer as he once had. He wasn't slipping into a simple animal's mind. This was something different, something deeper. He could feel the trees, their roots tangled beneath the earth, spreading across the north like veins. He could hear the voices in the wind, echoes of the past, whispers of the future, and then a vision, the wall, broken, the army of the dead, endless, the Night King standing at the heart of it all, staring at him. Not at Winterfell, at him. Bran's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't just another Stark. He wasn't just a crippled boy. The Night King was coming for him because Bran was something else, something he didn't yet understand. And if he didn't figure it out soon, Winterfell would fall. The walls of Winterfell shook with the force of battle. The dead slammed into the defences with relentless fury, clawing, biting and hacking at anything in their path. The Unsullied held their ground at the front lines, their discipline unmatched even against an enemy that felt no pain. But the sheer numbers of the undead were overwhelming. Jon fought on the battlements, cutting down wights with long claw, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The icy air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The living were losing ground. The gates of Winterfell trembled under the pressure of the dead. A group of giants, massive creatures now enslaved by the Night King, lumbered toward the wooden barricades. Their dead eyes glowed with eerie blue light as they raised their massive fists. Boom! The gate cracked. Boom! The wood splintered, men scrambling back in horror. Jon turned, his heart pounding. Archers! Take them down! Flaming arrows rained down upon the giants, but they barely flinched. With a final, earth-shaking strike, the gates shattered into pieces. The dead poured inside. Winterfell was breached. In the godswood, Bran's fingers dug into the wood of his chair. His breathing was shallow, his eyes glazed as he reached further into the void. The past, the present, the future, everything blurred together. He saw the children of the forest, creating the Night King, driving the dragon glass into the heart of a man who would become a monster. He saw the wall, built to keep out the darkness. He saw Aegon's conquest, the Targaryen dragons flying over a land that did not yet know its doom. And then he saw him, the Night King, standing among his army, his gaze fixed on Winterfell. But he wasn't looking at the castle. He wasn't looking at Jon or Daenerys. He was looking for Bran. Bran's body tensed as realization hit him like a blade to the gut. The Night King wasn't here just to kill the living. He was here for him. Because Bran wasn't just a Stark. He wasn't just
another piece in the game. He was something more.
Something that had been watching, waiting, guiding events since the beginning. The Night King wanted to end that. The realization sent a ripple of energy through Bran's mind. He focused, reaching deeper into the weirwood's power. If the Night King wanted him, then perhaps he could do something no one else could. He could fight back. Arya moved like a shadow through the chaos of Winterfell. Her dagger flashed as she slit the throat of a wight, her feet barely touching the ground. The dead had flooded into the courtyard, slaughtering anything in their path. She needed to get to Bran. If he was what the Night King wanted, then he needed protection. She sprinted toward the godswood, slipping past fighting soldiers, dodging the grasping hands of the dead. A wight lunged at her, and she twisted, driving her Valyrian steel dagger into its skull. The creature collapsed instantly, but she didn't stop to watch. She had to move, had to reach him before the Night King did. Behind her, a deafening roar filled the sky. Viserion, the undead dragon, had returned, and this time he was coming for the castle. Viserion's icy breath struck the castle walls, sending massive chunks of stone crumbling down. Soldiers screamed as the undead dragon's frostfire consumed them, their bodies frozen solid before shattering into pieces. The air itself felt like it was turning to ice as death swept through Winterfell. Jon barely had time to react. From his position near the courtyard, he watched in horror as the wights poured in through the broken gates, cutting down anything in their path. His heart pounded as he saw the Night King at the far end of the battlefield, standing atop his monstrous steed. The undead leader did not rush.
Did not panic. He was waiting. Jon knew what for. Drogon, now! Daenerys' voice echoed through the sky as her dragon descended, flames roaring from his jaws. Fire swept over the battlefield, consuming countless wights in an instant.
Heat was intense, momentarily pushing back the cold that had gripped the castle. For a moment, hope flickered. Then the Night King raised his hand, and the flames vanished. Jon stared in disbelief. The fire had simply dissipated like a candle, snuffed out in the wind. Daenerys gasped from atop Drogon, her dragon recoiling mid-air as if confused. Jon's stomach twisted. He's stronger than we thought. The battle was turning. Arya reached the godswood, her breath ragged. The white leaves of the weirwood tree rustled slightly in the cold wind, but she barely noticed. Her eyes locked onto Bran, still seated beneath the ancient tree, his expression distant, lost. Mira Reed stood beside him, gripping her spear tightly. Ghost was there too, growling low in his throat. "Bran!" Arya called, her voice urgent. He didn't respond. His eyes were milky white, his mind lost in something deeper. Mira turned toward her. "He's seeing something. I don't know what, but he's different." Arya swallowed. She had seen Bran's abilities before, but this was something else. The air grew colder. Arya's instincts screamed at her. She turned sharply, her grip tightening around her dagger. A shadow moved beyond the trees. She barely had time to react before the dead stepped into the godswood. White walkers. 3 of them. They moved with eerie grace, their cold blue eyes locking on to Bran. Arya didn't hesitate. She darted forward, her Valyrian steel dagger flashing in the moonlight. The first White Walker raised his ice blade to block her attack, but she twisted mid-air, flipping over him and plunging her weapon straight into his throat. The walker disintegrated into shards of ice. The second one lunged at her. Arya ducked, but the creature was fast, faster than she expected. Its ice blade sliced across her arm, leaving a burning wound. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the pain, and drove her dagger upward. It met its mark. The second White Walker shattered. Only one remained, and this one did not attack. Instead, it stepped aside. Arya's heart pounded. That could only mean one thing. The Night King was coming. Jon fought his way through the courtyard, his sword cutting through whites with savage precision. Bodies fell around him, but there were always more. He was exhausted, bleeding, but he had to get to Bran. Above him, Viserion let out another shriek, his frost fire blasting across the battlefield. Then Jon saw him. The Night King was walking toward the godswood. Jon's breath hitched. No, not Bran. He pushed forward, but the dead closed in around him. There were too many. He wasn't going to make it. Then a roar split the night. Drogon. The great dragon swooped down, unleashing a torrent of fire in Jon's path. The whites burned away instantly, clearing a path. Jon didn't hesitate. He ran toward Bran, toward the godswood, toward the final battle. The godswood was eerily silent, the snow untouched except for the bodies of the fallen White Walkers. The last embers of their shattered forms faded into the cold night, leaving only Bran, Arya, Meera, and Ghost beneath the ancient weirwood tree. Arya clenched her jaw, her wounded arm stinging from the walker's blade. She could feel the unnatural, cold spreading from the cut, but she forced herself to ignore it. Bran remained still, his eyes rolled back, lost in whatever vision had taken hold of him. Then the temperature dropped further. The wind stilled, the air froze, and he appeared. The Night King stepped into the godswood with slow, deliberate strides, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Bran. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone was suffocating. Arya tightened her grip on her dagger. Meera lifted her spear. Ghost bared his teeth, growling low in his throat. But none of them moved. The Night King wasn't looking at them. He was looking through them. He was here for Bran. The silence was deafening. Then, in the distance, the sound of hurried footsteps. Jon Snow burst into the godswood, his chest heaving, Longclaw gripped in his hand. His eyes locked onto the Night King, and for a split second neither of them moved. Then Jon charged. The Night King raised his hand. Jon's legs froze mid-stride as an invisible force slammed into him. He was thrown backward, crashing into the snow, gasping for breath. His limbs felt numb, useless. The Night King hadn't even drawn his weapon. Jon struggled to rise, but the weight of the cold pressed down on him. The Night King stepped forward. Arya saw her moment. She darted forward, swift as a shadow, her Valyrian steel dagger aimed at his throat. He caught her mid-air. Arya choked as his frozen hand closed around her neck. The dagger slipped from her grasp, landing in the snow with a dull thud. The Night King tilted his head, studying her like one might study an insect before crushing it. Then he threw her aside. Arya hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. She gasped, struggling to rise, but her body wouldn't respond. The cold had seeped into her very bones. Jon roared, struggling to stand, but the dead surrounded him now, holding him back. The Night King turned back to Bran. He took another step forward. Then Bran spoke. "I know what you are." The Night King halted. Bran's eyes cleared, his gaze locking onto the creature before him. There was no fear in his expression, only understanding. "I see you," Bran whispered. And then the godswood shifted, the trees groaned, the air crackled, and the world around them changed. Jon, still struggling against the whites, felt it first. A strange pull, like the very fabric of reality, was being unravelled. The dead hesitated, their movements slowing, as if they, too, sensed something was wrong. The Night King's head tilted slightly. Bran's pupils dilated. His body remained seated, but his mind reached out. And suddenly Jon wasn't in the godswood anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere ancient. Jon gasped as he found himself standing in a vast, snow-covered field. The sky above was dark, filled with swirling, unnatural clouds. There were no stars, no sun, just emptiness. Before him stood the Night King, but this was not Winterfell. Jon turned, his breath visible in the frigid air. Behind the Night King an enormous tree loomed, a weirwood, but larger than any he had ever seen. Its blood-red leaves rustled in a wind he could not feel. Its roots stretched out endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The Night King took a step forward. Jon raised his sword, his heart hammering in his chest. Then Bran's voice echoed in the air. This is where it began. Jon turned sharply. Bran stood beside him. But he wasn't as Jon remembered. He was standing tall, no longer bound to his chair, his face calm, but his eyes were different. They weren't just Bran's eyes, they were something older. Johnny barely had time to process it before the Night King attacked. He moved with inhuman speed, his ice blades slicing toward Jon's throat. Jon barely raised Longclaw in time, steel clashing against ice. The impact sent a jolt through his entire body. The Night King pressed forward, his strength overwhelming. Jon gritted his teeth, muscles straining. Then Bran touched Jon's shoulder. And suddenly Jon saw everything, the creation of the Night King, the children of the forest driving the dragon glass into his heart, the centuries of waiting, watching, growing stronger, the long night that nearly destroyed the world, the endless cycle, a war that was never meant to end, a war that had been fought over and over again. Jon staggered back, his mind reeling. This already happened. Yes, Bran said. His voice was distant, echoing.
And it will keep happening again and again.
Jon's eyes snapped back to the Night King. He wasn't just an enemy. He was a wound in the world, a wound that had never healed. The Night King lunged again. Jon reacted instinctively, bringing his sword up. But Bran moved, not physically, but his presence shifted. His eyes locked onto the Night King, and for the first time the Night King hesitated. Bran lifted his hand, and the roots of the weirwood moved. They lashed out like living things, wrapping around the Night King's limbs, tightening, pulling. The Night King struggled, his icy aura flaring, but the roots held strong. Jon didn't hesitate. He plunged Longclaw into the Night King's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ice shattered. The Night King let out a silent scream, his form cracking like glass. His body collapsed inward, dissolving into mist, vanishing into the wind. The sky shifted. The darkness faded. The wound in the world began to heal. Jon gasped as he was pulled back to the godswood. He fell to his knees, breathless, the cold still, clinging to him. The dead around him crumbled to dust, their bodies falling apart as if they had never existed. The Night King was gone. Bran sat beneath the weirwood, his eyes closed, his face calm. Jon looked around. Arya was stirring. Mira was shaking. Ghost was sniffing at the air as if trying to understand what had happened. The battle was over. The living had won. But as Jon looked at Bran, a shiver ran through him, because he knew Bran Stark had not just waged a battle in Winterfell. He had fought something much older. And now he wasn't just Bran anymore, he was something else. Something that had finally broken the cycle, something the world would never fully understand. The war for the Dawn had
ended, but the story of Bran the Broken had only just begun.